started here. Welcome, everyone. I'm sure, like I said, we'll have some more people hop on later, so we will certainly let them in. My name is Nicole. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at the International Sculpture Center. So for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a member-based nonprofit organization founded in 1960. And our mission is to champion the creation and understanding of sculpture and its unique, vital contribution to society. We are an inclusive community for anyone with an interest and commitment in the field of sculpture. We also publish Sculpture Magazine, which is the essential source for information, criticism, and dialogue about all forms of contemporary sculpture internationally. So be sure to check out sculpturemagazine.art and sculpture.org if you want to learn a little bit more about us. We are recording this session today, so you'll notice that you were muted when you came on. I will just ask that you stay muted until we open up the field later for the Q&A. Your video is on, but that's up to you. You can certainly turn it off. As I mentioned, we will do a Q&A later. If you'd like to type questions in the chat throughout the presentation so that you don't forget them, I will be monitoring, so you can certainly do that. Before we get officially started, I just want to thank Upward & Associates and Amy and our panelists for collaborating on this event with us. I'm super excited to share this with you. So if you just give me a moment, I'm going to have Jennifer take it away and get us started. Jennifer, whenever you are ready.
Great. Thank you so much to Nicole and to everyone at the ISC. This is such an exciting collaboration today. So I first want to give you a little bit of a background on Upward & Associates. It was an organization founded by Amy Snyder over about 1 year ago, and it is really kind of came out of the pandemic as a wonderful opportunity. Amy had the idea to assist artists and really mentor artists with their career and be of resource to provide a 1-hour Zoom session with one of our Upward & Associates mentors. We have over 14 mentors in the group and a wide variety of background. And we've over in the past year served over 90 artists, which is so exciting. And we look forward to working with even more artists as our organization grows. So if you want more details, please visit us at upwardandassociates.org and apply for a session upcoming. And Nicole will give the members of ISC some more details at the end of our session. So I will introduce myself as one of the panelists. I am Jennifer Kloss, and I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I am an art advisor and founder of Collector House, my business, which assists clients in acquiring works of art. And I'm also an independent curator, and I look forward to moderating the session today. So I'm going to now have each of our panelists give a short introduction to themselves. Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Liz Garvey, and I'm an art dealer. My company name is Garvey Simon. And prior to that, I was an art advisor. Actually, I'm still an art advisor. I'm wearing more and more hats as I'm getting older. And then prior to that, in the 90s, I worked for a contemporary art gallery on 57th Street. I also curate shows and have loved being part of this organization to help artists. It's obviously, it's very needed. I think everybody knows that. And so thank you, Amy, for creating it.
Thank you, Liz. Carla.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carla Hansell. I am here with my company. It's called Vantage Point Projects, and I'm a public art consultant. Recently, I have managed the Percent for Art program for the city of Charlotte, and including the Charlotte Douglas International Airport, the county, and the city. Before that, I was a contemporary art curator at the Mint Museum for 10 years. So my background really is arts administration, art consulting, and the project that I now have is Carla Hansell LLC Vantage Point Projects. So it's really the umbrella organization where I can do public art consulting, independent curating, writing, and then I'm still doing work with the Charlotte Douglas International Airport and their program of integrating art into their infrastructure program. So happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us today. Next, Christine Ann Jones.
Hi, my name is Christine. I am based in New York City, and I've been a commercial photographer for about 20 years. I started, I guess, very luckily when I was 14 years old, working commercially. And I have been working specifically in photographing fine art for auction houses and for galleries for the past 7 years. And more specifically, for the past 2 years, I've been working almost exclusively with Pace Gallery here in New York City, photographing their internal artists' works for shows. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Jennifer and Christine. So Christine, if you want to just tell me when to move to the next slide as you're speaking, I will switch it up for you. But Jennifer, I don't know if you have anything you want to add about the program before we let Christine kind of get started.
No, I think that's it. I just wanted to, yes, emphasize that if anyone, has a question, yes, please make note of it in the chat, and we hope to get as much content covered in this session as possible. So.
Great. All right, let's get moving then. I'll get this the slide going. Apologies, sometimes with the computer, it just, to get that first slide started, there's a little bit of a delay. There we go. All right. When you're ready.
No problem. So I'm going to start off with the equipment that you should use when photographing your own art. You can use both an amateur or professional camera, as long as your megapixels are, 20 megapixels or higher, ideally. And if you have control of the f-stop, even better. But you can also photograph your own art with your phone, as long as your phone is relatively new. So I would probably say like no older than 2 to 3 years, just because of how great the cameras get on your phones every year. They get a little bit better. If you are using your phone, make sure you use the back camera though, and make sure you have your flash off. You should also, for a phone, probably get a macro lens attachment. And this will allow you to get really close-up details of your work, sculptures, paintings, anything. And I think details can be very important, especially if texture is really important in your work. And then I would also always shoot on a tripod for your phone. You can get a phone attachment to the top of your tripod, and that will just make things easier for you later on. If you are using a digital camera over your phone, you can generally use whichever lens came with the camera, or if it's not a single lens reflex camera, so if the lens doesn't come off, it's just already built into the camera, that should be fine too. But if you do have a lens that's detachable, you could also get a macro lens for that camera to shoot details. That would also be wonderful. Aside from that, that's like your most basic of equipment that you should have for shooting your own work. Tripod, it doesn't need to be anything very, very expensive. It just needs to be a very basic tripod, kind of like shown in the slide. And then the other picture is the macro attachments lens for a camera, for your phone camera. And then the other thing I would get is a color card. If you can go to the next slide. So this is a color card. And this will be important for making sure your white balance is correct. So, you know, when you take a picture and it looks like really yellow, it looks really blue, that's because your white balance isn't quite correct in terms of like what it thinks the color temperature of the room is. Your ideal color temperature is like your daylight color temperature. That's probably the most neutral. And I think that's probably about it in terms of equipment, aside from some lights that I will explain about in a little bit. Where you're going to want to photograph your work, you're probably going to want to have, like, ideally, if it's a painting or a flat work that mounts on a wall, have it mounted on a wall. And if you could have it on a clean, neutral wall, so it'd be a white wall or a gray wall, that will make your life easier in terms of like editing later on. For the light, if it's mounted on a wall, ideally you're using sunlight if you have windows in the space you're working in. If you don't have windows, you can use external light sources. So that would be your lights you can set up. So this would be the light equipment you would probably want to get. And this would be, I have 2 lights, 4 lights maybe, if it's a really big work. If you go to the next slide, I think I have a slide that shows the setup for that. Yeah, so this would be for photographing a flat work that's mounted on a wall. You're going to want to get 2 lights. The cheapest way you could do this, you could get the clamp lights from Home Depot or Lowe's or another home improvement store, and then get smart light bulbs where you can control the color temp of the light bulb on your phone. So if you do have some windows, but it's just not quite bright enough, you can supplement your light with these lights, and then you can match the color temp of the light bulb to the color temp of daylight. It's super easy to do. And the directions when you get the light bulb will show you how to set the color temp. But you're going to want to set those lights at 45-degree angles from you and basically from the artwork. So it lights from both sides, and that creates a really nice even light. Moving on to how you use the color card. Ideally, you use the color card for every work you're photographing. So you take a picture of the color card first, holding it in front of your work. So if you like put your camera on a timer, you run over, you hold the card in front of it, you take a picture. And this is not anything you would share with a gallery, but it's just good for you to have. So if you need to check the color of the work in the photos, if you don't have the work anymore for any reason, you have a very set, like, you know, this is the accurate color temperature and these are the accurate colors. But you can just keep those like in your own internal files. If you are using, if you're photographing a sculpture, you're gonna want to decide like how you want the sculpture to be presented in a public space. So if the sculpture is supposed to be outside, you know, of course, photograph it outside. If it's supposed to be on a pedestal, photograph it on a pedestal. If it's ideally on a table, if it's really small, like take in all those to consideration and the way you want the public to see it. And that's how you should probably photograph it. If for lighting for sculptures, you can generally do it with windows if you have enough light. If you don't have enough light, you can use the supplemental light. 1 or 2 lights are generally fine. You ideally are using more directional light, so you can emphasize the shadows in the sculpture to like really show the shape of it. But if the shadows are getting a bit too dark, you can add an additional light. And the great thing about the smart light bulbs is you can change the strength of the light. So you can have a really strong light like on the left side and a much weaker light on the right side, just to fill in those shadows so the shadows don't look really dark. And then when you're actually photographing the work, for the settings of your camera, the settings on your phone, ideally for your phone, you're going to use an additional app that allows you to have a little bit more control. For your camera, you're going to want to set, I think if you go to the next slide, it shows the grid detail. Yeah. So you're going to want to set on your camera, and this will be in your manual for your camera. And you can also set this on most phones in the phone app. This 3:9 rectangle detail. And this will allow you to like line up everything you're photographing. So everything is straight, it's in the middle. So you have less work for editing later on, basically. For the other settings for your f-stop, you're gonna want to set an f-stop in the middle range. So I would say like F9 is usually a good go-to. And then you're gonna want to let your shutter speed be set automatically to the f-stop, because you don't need, the shutter speed isn't as necessarily important. And if you don't have a lot of light, that means the shutter speed is going to be really, really slow. So instead of like a 60th, which you can photograph holding a camera and there be no camera shake, but if you go below a 60th and you're holding the camera, you're going to get camera shake, so everything's going to look blurry. And that would be also why it's a good thing to keep everything on a tripod, because then you won't have camera shake. You won't have to worry about trying to keep your hands really still. And an additional great thing to do for photographing your work is always set it on a timer, be it a 1-second timer, even 5-second timer, to give you enough time to press the shutter release button on your phone or on your camera, and then lift your hands away, because the action of, especially if you're using a really slow shutter speed, so like 1-second shutter speed or even a 2-second shutter speed, you have time to move your hands away. So the action of pressing the shutter doesn't shake the camera while the shutter is opening. Let me think if there's any, in addition, you can use different things to like change your space to make the lighting better or less, like having shears on your window. If you're doing it on a really sunny day and the light is just too bright or too harsh, if you can put shears in front of the window, that will really, really help cut down on that light or make the light softer. Because ideally you're photographing on like maybe middle of the day on an overcast day, that's like your best light. If you need to fill in more shadows and you don't have enough lights, you can also use like white foam core, white poster board. You can wrap foam core poster board in a tin foil, and you can reflect light from the windows or from the external light sources you're using back into the work to fill in those spaces. And that works really well. It's very handy. It's a hack a lot of photographers use. For the type of images you should have, ideally you have your main view image that just shows the work and a little bit of the wall around it, or a little bit of the external area if it's a sculpture. And this is true for really oversized works and small works. Then for additional images you should get is probably like your angle views of the canvas if the work wraps around the edges of the canvas. This is especially important for sculptures because sculptures so often are multi-sided, so you want to get photographs of all the sides. And then ideally for your details, I always like to get at least 3 details, more if there's time and if you're able. I think kind of touched a little bit on everything. Let me go over. So you see the 2 images at the bottom of this slide. So this is about keystoning. So you know when you're photographing a sculpture or a canvas, and like ideally the work is very square in your viewfinder. All the lines are straight, all the corners are squared up. That's the best way to do it. As you can see on that first detail on the bottom left side, where it shows the camera at the same angle as the work flat on the wall, that will make all your corners square. You see the other ones where the work is tilted away or tilted to, you want to match the angle you're shooting at to the angle the work is at, particularly for flat art, be it oversized or small. This way you'll have less editing to do in post. If you can't get it for whatever reason, you can't get the corners squared, that can be fixed in editing, both in a camera app, that's very easy to do, and in Photoshop if you have the ability or the software to use Photoshop. For additional things in Photoshop to do, like you want to clean up the space if there's scuffs or nail holes on the wall, you want to remove those, and that can be done in a phone app or in Photoshop. If you're photographing a sculpture and let's say it's on the floor or on a table and there's like maybe some scratches or scuff marks or dirt or dust on the floor and stuff like that, you want to clean those up in post also. You ideally also are photographing it on a very neutral background, unless it's outside, of course, because then the background would be very important to it. And there are phone apps, and in Photoshop, you can neutralize the background if it's like looking really yellow or looking really blue for whatever reason. I would go in and desaturate that if you can, and there's a whole bunch of YouTube videos and stuff like that that will show you how to do that. Let's see if I have anything else. For more settings in your camera, I would shoot at ISO 100. I would, if you have experience working with raw files and have Photoshop and can do the post in Photoshop, I would shoot raw files. You'll have an easier time with editing afterwards. If you don't know how to do that, then a large JPEG format is fine. I think that's probably it in terms of the rest of the settings. The white balance setting, the easiest thing for you to do if you're using a camera is to set it to auto. There is an additional setting in there if you read your manual really carefully where you can set the white balance. So that's when you can use the color card. And once you have that first photograph of the color card, you can use that setting to go in and select the color card, and then it'll calibrate the camera to balance to that color card. If you don't have the ability to do that, either because you're using a phone or you're using a camera that doesn't have those settings, that's okay. The auto white balance setting will still work for you. That we went through the shot list. If you're shooting loose paperworks, the easiest, if it isn't going to harm the artwork, is if you can tack it on the wall. That'll make your life really easier. If you can't do that and you need to keep it loose for whatever reason, you can put it on the ground and you can shoot it from overhead. You will just need to correct that keystoning in post because you won't be able to get it exactly overhead unless you have like an overhead arm, which is an extra piece of equipment you really won't need unless you do this a lot. For shooting those, you can use the same. If you go back one more slide, go back to the last slide. So if you're shooting overhead, you're basically still using this idea of the 45-degree angles, So instead you have the lights on either side of the work going at 45-degree angles down to the work. And then your camera, instead of it being front, is overhead of it. And that will get you your nice, like, even lighting. For any additional editing, kind of went over everything. For cropping of the main view, you want to get pretty close. If you're photographing a sculpture, the only thing I would never crop out is a shadow. If the shadow is particularly long, that means your crop's going to be a bit bigger, because I think it just makes any editing later on much easier if you always include the full shadow. If you want to make the shadow shorter, you just adjust your lights and you adjust the position of the sculpture so you can get a shorter shadow. And then for shadows, one other additional thing I would add on to that. Shadows can be very, very important for sculptures. It can really add a lot to it. So you really need to think about, like, what you want that shadow to look like and where you want that shadow to be positioned, whether it's coming from the left or the right, if it's slightly going from behind, and how dark or light that shadow you want. And those can all be adjusted by the light from the window and your external light sources, and using the foam core to balance more light in. I would also suggest creating a file naming structure to make it really easy to find your files later on, even if it's a year or two down the road. So usually I put in dates into my files and names of works into the files, so they make it much easier to find. And I think that's about it. There is, on the Upward and Associates website, everything I talked about is on a guide that is available for everyone to refer back to. And it has all of this information for you. And I think that's everything.
Thank you, Christine. I just want to say I did see some questions come through the chat. So
Yeah.
as participants, I just wanted you to know I see them and we will answer them later, but they have been seen. And I'll just mention it again. If anything comes up, please type it in the chat and I can read it aloud later. All right, so Carla, whenever you are ready, I believe the next slide is yours and you can take it away.
Okay, great. Well, as I mentioned, a lot of the work that I do is integrating art into architecture, working very directly and early on with planners and architects. So the slide that we have before us now is Mark Fornes' Wonderwall. And this is a very large scale architectural screening for a parking deck structure. It's also a major point of reference in the city of Charlotte, coming from the south end of Charlotte into the center city Charlotte. And then it's also accessible by the beltway that goes around the city of Charlotte. So it really needs to be presented on various levels of scale, from a far distance of, maybe as far back as a mile, but then also very close up, because it's part of a mixed use development that includes Whole Foods, an apartment building, and 2 hotels. We were really honored that this project did win the American for the Arts, one of the best 50 works in the US in the year 2019. And he is both an artist based in New York, as well as an architect. He's really well known for computational design. So each of his, the work with this particular sculpture has over 5,000 different individual parts. And you can move to the next slide, please. And then it's also ridge, so it creates kind of a ridge type structure that also gives it architectural integrity. He was very influenced by the idea of flow dynamics. So the design is based on flow dynamics. Some people think it looks a little bit like a Van Gogh, his stars, but it really is based on the idea of liquid and flow dynamics. So it's a very contemporary sort of design and concept. He works very closely with a photographer, Studio Naro, which is based in London. She is a well-known photographer for architects. They both used to work for Zaha Hadid, so that's how they made their initial connection. And he actually flies her into each of the areas where he's been asked to do commissions. So I guess something that's really important for artists is that you have kind of unity to the type of photographs that you have in your portfolio. So, you know, ideally work with a single photographer, or, you know, all of the wonderful information that Christine gave today, you know, using all those tips of being really impeccable with your lighting, with the angles. It's really going to help you have a lot of success. And ultimately, it really is the image of your artwork that helps promote your career. So I can't emphasize strongly enough just how important it is to get really excellent photos to show to curators, to show to potential clients that might be looking at you as opposed to other artists for commissions. I just can't overemphasize the importance of great photography and allowing a budget if you can. If you do have a commission, allow budget to make sure that you are able to enlist a photographer, or that you have the skills yourself to be able to get great artwork. So we'll move on to the next slide. The other artist that I really admire his photography is Matthew Mazzata. This is a large-scale sculpture for the city of Springfield, Missouri. It actually harvests rainwater and then is used to integrate it back into a public garden, and then to pump the rainwater from the holding facility. It's actually tied to the rocking of the rocking chairs. So as people sit in the structure and rock, it helps to bring the water up to then be able to serve as an irrigation system. One of the tips that I've learned from working with photographers that focus in the landscape is to look at the light of especially early morning or before that noon time. Another tip, especially in the South, where there's a great deal of humidity, is to really try to eliminate some of the humidity within the atmosphere. So oftentimes it's right after dawn, the 3 hours after dawn. And the perfect time is really the day after a major rainstorm. So I thought I would just add that in terms of exterior outdoor sculpture, is that managing really the amount of the water within the air actually impacts how the light's going to hit the sculpture. So you want to have ideally a condition where there isn't a great deal of water, a high dew point within the air. So another little tip that I've learned in working with photographers. Okay, we'll move to the next slide, please. This is another one of his shots, open house in York, Alabama. He's all about creating spaces for community. So this actually is a structure that opens to create an outdoor area where individuals can watch a film or some other presentation. And I think it's also really important to show action shots, especially with outdoor sculpture. So oftentimes the artist isn't able to incorporate a video, although many times videos are recorded at the time that the whole artwork is documented. And I think it is important to have a video if you can, but sometimes in competing for competitions, videos aren't allowed. So it's important to have some reference of action by representation of people, by showing how the sculpture works, if it is indeed kinetic or has some sort of interactive component, to make sure that that is represented within the photography that is done to document the work. On to the next slide, please. And then this is a very whimsical design for the Tampa International Airport. It's a large flamingo, so it appears that the flamingo is actually reaching into the water and maybe getting some shrimp as people are walking through this. So it's a really wonderful play in scale. I think showing people within the space, interacting and using the sculpture is a lot more impressive than just having a single shot of the artwork. Especially art that's in public places, it's important to show how the public is interacting with the artwork. Okay, we'll move on to the next shot. This is another one of Mark Fornes's. I think I meant to have that sooner, but again, this is another project that he did for Charlotte. It's a sculpture that shows, it's actually a pavilion. The exterior is white, and then the interior has these vaulted rooms that go from pillars of pink into kind of blue, almost like a dome type shape. So this was, again, the opportunity to really bring the sculpture to life by showing how the light plays through the sculpture to create the shadows, how individuals are interacting with it, and also to give some sense of scale. Okay, on to the next sculpture, or on to the next slide, please. This is Marker. It was commissioned by an organization, Washington, D.C. And I think this is really beautifully, a beautiful image that shows somewhat of the scale of the sculpture. I'm sure Christine could tell us about the angle. It almost looks like a lens that, feel free to jump in here, Christine.
Yeah, it's a wide angle lens.
Yeah. So the wide angle lens, it distorts it to some degree, but it also really gives it a sense of scale and presence. And like as you look at the sculpture, the architect, the buildings behind it are less emphasized. So the wide angle is another great tool for capturing sculpture, although it does distort it to some degree. Okay, on to the next slide, please. Again, kind of an action shot. This is the same technique that was used by Mark Fornes's photographer. So it's basically playing with the shutter speed so that it's slowed down so that the cars or anything that moves, it's created as just like a streak rather than having the cars be something that distracts from the sculpture. So that's another really important tool. Again, I would encourage you to ask Christine the technical details about that, but just note that that's a really good way to, if you're photographing sculpture and there's distracting things like cars, play with your shutter speed or know what you're doing with the shutter speed to create that blur. Okay, and then the next, and then also, I think it's important to show, again, the artist. If you can, it's good to have an artist image or showing like the maquette and how the maquette really was used as the model, and then that the realized sculpture is very closely aligned to the maquette. Sometimes that's something that especially developers want to see, that they're getting really what's promised to them in the maquette. So that's good to show that, that from concept to final design, that you're able to follow through with that. And then that was her initial drawing. Okay, on to the next. And if I'm taking too long, let me know. I only have 25 slides. This is another Project One studio, Silverton, Ohio. Again, this is a good sense of scale and material. A lot of idea, the detail of the type of painting, the clarity of color. I wouldn't be surprised if they did use a color card to get the exact representation of colors that are included in the sculpture. Onto the next slide, please. Again, kind of a detail of this artwork, again in DC, there are two different interpretations of it depending on which side you're looking at. So plate shift. So from one angle, it's primarily violets and pink, and then from the other angle, it's oranges, or I mean yellow and blue and green. So, however the photo is done, just be sure that it really captures, as Christine said, from all angles, so that it really does document the full experience of the artwork. And then on to the next slide, please. And then I think this is also a good example of just showing, again, people interacting with the artwork. Interestingly enough, this is a concept design, but when shown to other clients, it looks like it's actually a realized artwork. So I think that's also something that's really good in terms of, having those Photoshop skills and other design skills, where the concept can be so perfectly rendered that it almost looks like a completed artwork. So I throw that in there too for artists that are working on commissions, you know, just really work on those skills of the concept design, because again, that really helps the client be able to understand and realize what the final design will look like. Okay, on to the next slide, please. And then also experiences at different times of day, because especially within public artwork, oftentimes it needs to be activated at both day and night. So this has an internal lighting element, so it can show how the light actually works within it at night. Okay, on to the next slide, please. Brian Mccutchen, I thought this was a really whimsical, very small sculpture, but it was for the Goethe Institute in New York. It was a playful way of looking like, you know, like a gnome was actually captured within signage. And then this is a close-up detail. So again, just the idea of having the artwork photographed and then the whimsy of it with a closer detail is always really important. On to the next one, please. This is another one of the signposts that he's created. In this case, I don't know if he really had the luxury of getting the exact time to have the best shot of this artwork. So I throw this in there as well. I would use this as an example of probably not the best documentation of the artwork. There's a lot of distracting detail. The light isn't really very great. It's a rainy day. To the right, there's like some sort of a banner that is coming down. You know, it's retail space. It's not, it looks kind of abandoned. Even though the sculpture is really great and it has interactive components, I would use this as an example of probably not the best type of photography for the reasons that I outline. But, you know, sometimes, you know, there just isn't the opportunity, and a photograph is better than none. So always make sure you have a photograph, but if I were Brian, I would go back and make sure that he gets a better shot of this. Okay, on to the next one, please. Again, this is showing the idea of the shadows and how it works within a space. There again, he's using the early morning light. And I think this creates a really, you know, just beautiful illumination in terms of really not using a lot of additional lighting. And then on to the next slide, please. Exterior shot. This is midday. As Christine mentioned, that's also, you know, a really good time. This is in Indianapolis. There's not as bad humidity there as there is in Charlotte. So really good lighting of exterior work there. And on to the next one, please. And the next one, a detail. This is Cementiscope. It's an interactive artwork in Norfolk, Virginia, where an old cement mixer is actually turned into a large-scale kaleidoscope. There again, it shows people working with this sculpture, interacting with it, and then the signage. So I think this is, I really like this photograph because it kind of captures the industrial aspect of the artwork, the aspect of the neighborhood, and people enjoying the artwork. Onto the next work, please. Yeah, and then there's the detail shot of the lens. So, you know, and showing this to clients, they would have a sense of the kaleidoscope quality, and then just, you know, people, just how it works from kind of a street level about people enjoying this installation. On to the next slide, please. This is Risa Puno, Common Ground. It's a table setting slash installation, and this moves from place to place. So it's actually an exterior sculpture installation that can be sited at different parks, and it has been moving around the US in different parks and settings. On to the next slide. There's the detail again of where you can really see the glass tiles. Again, the lighting is really beautiful, the green grass, you know, there's not a lot of exterior distractions. I think this is another really great photo of the detail of this artwork. Next one, please. June Kaneko, his Tanuki sculptures. These have been exhibited around the US, Millennium Park in Chicago, the zoo in Omaha, the Kennedy Center. So again, here's an example of giving a sense of scale, having a person in there, taking a photo with it, the selfie op, and then also the more architectural setting, studio environment where it's also based, one can get a scale by, the way it's situated in the room. So I think both of these photos are good examples of photography for Kaneko's Tanukis. On to the next one, please. That's it. Okay. I hope that gives you some ideas about photography for exterior artwork. And if there are any questions, you can just put them in the notes. But again, I just really emphasize the importance of great photography because it's really how you market and sell your artwork and how you represent yourself.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Carla.
We're on the same time here, Jennifer. Yeah, so but I'll hand it back over to Jennifer and our panelists before we officially kind of move towards the Q&A. So you can go ahead and take it away, Lee.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to Christine and Carla for your really informative presentations. I think this brings up a lot of great topics when we're looking at how photography is so essential to your work as an artist, and then also to the greater art world in general. So especially for in terms of trying to get your work out there and selling your work, and for my role even as an art advisor in the way I look at so many images every day, and especially in the pandemic where I haven't had the opportunity to visit galleries or as many galleries or artist studios in person. So that leads me to sort of this idea of, looking at the shot list again and trying to capture as much as you can of your work and really what shots you should provide. So Liz, I thought I'd start with you and see, just from your opinion, what do you look for when working with artists for a shot list?
Well, when I'm working with sculptors in particular, and they are submitting work to me, let's say, to look at, and I haven't seen it in person, it's really helpful. I mean, you want to have a beautiful image, obviously, as it was discussed before, but it's really helpful to put it in context, like some of the outdoor sculpture in those slides. So it's helpful for me to see beautiful images of the sculpture, perhaps isolated and, more professional. I also like to see a studio shot. I like to see what it looks like in context for scale. And that's easier to do with, public art that's outside. But for individual pieces, I really enjoy seeing great shots and then seeing it maybe in the studio or somewhere, whether it's exhibited in a show. If it's a piece that goes on a pedestal, I want to see it on the pedestal. I don't want to just see the image of it. I want to really get a sense of it. And I also can't stress enough the importance of video with sculpture, especially. I really appreciate it when an artist has something, and it's trickier, right? Because this isn't a presentation about video, it's a presentation about photography. But I know that there are devices that can be used for the iPhone to make it more steady. That's really helpful for me to sort of have a three-dimensional view of the work. And finally, another thing I would say, just like the slides that we looked at, where there was the medium was described, having captions when people look at the work that describes the medium and the size in particular. Because you don't always know when you're looking at something. Is that glass? Is it ceramic? Is it metal? So having that right there in conjunction with the image, people are impatient. They don't want to have to dig deeper and figure out what medium are you using, what size is this? So having all the information right there is really helpful.
And I think that's a great tip to add about the scale, and be specific with your measurements. Tell us about what the image size is, and also the frame size if a work is framed, because I think that is obviously very, very helpful. And on this note of framing, I wanted to get Christine's opinion on when a work is framed. Is that a secondary image of getting a side profile of the frame, or how do you view framing?
So it really depends if the frame is integral to the work, basically. Like the frame, it's artist provided, it's an important piece of the work, like it fully is the work. Then the frame is very important in the photography. And then you're also photographing it as almost more of a like 3D work than just a flat work, let's say like a paper work. So that's why when I was saying like, particularly for canvases, this is true for frames too, is you want to get these angled shots coming in from the side. So instead of having your lights at 45-degree angles, you're going to actually be at a 45-degree angle to the work. Those can be particularly important for this stuff, because it also gives you like a sense of scale of like how much it comes out from the wall, or if your work that hangs on a wall is actually 3D, like if there's pieces that like are additional to it. Let me give an artist as an example. If you look up Louie Hollowell, her works, when you see a front facing photograph of it, is very flat. It just looks like a very flat geometric painting. But when you see the angled sides of it, you can see that it's actually all those geometric shapes are actually 3D. They come out from the work. So that's when those angled shots are like even more important. And I would say that's true in particular for oversized works.
I think that's great. And even the side profile of a frame it sometimes ends up being a very key part of what I'm showing to clients, because they really want to look at how the piece is finished in terms of.
You would want to get like a detail shot of the side profile of the frame, where you see the side of the frame and you see the side of the painting and maybe like how they join together and the differences between them. So that is definitely like a detail that you should photograph when you're getting details.
And then also, if a piece is framed and under plexiglass, is that something that also you take into consideration of?
I mean, for the most part, you never want to see the glass. Like that should not be something that's obvious in the photograph. So you don't want to see any glare. So this can make photographing it particularly tricky. You have to manipulate the lights a lot. A lot of the times you need to get like really large black foam core to block off like your space. This is also really important to have your camera or your phone set on a timer on a tripod, so you can press the shutter and then walk to the side of the room where you're no longer being reflected in the plexiglass. So that's when you use the timer. If your tripod is now reflecting into the work, you can wrap your tripod and kind of even wrap your camera just so you see like the lens sticking out basically in fabric to like really neutralize everything. And we'll even take like pieces of black foam core and cut out like a little circle for the lens and put it in front of the camera to really block out stuff.
And that plexiglass is probably one of the more challenging.
Yeah, it's definitely the thing that makes things the trickiest, particularly if the artwork has a lot of solid dark colors. That's when reflections really get really tricky, because it's not like if it's just like a white paper or even a cream colored paper, that's the majority of like the work or the sculpture, like then you won't get as many reflections. But when you get like large sections of solid dark colors or black, then that's when reflections become particularly tricky. And in those instances, I would say it will be very difficult to photograph the work yourself without like a full set of professional equipment.
And that is something to note also, as well as even as our artists here that have joined us today, that perhaps, set these goals and these shot lists of what you need of your work and figure out your own skills versus when you need to outsource or bring someone on to teach you further education, and or just having someone come in and assist you in photographing the work.
Yeah, and a lot of it is experimentation of like, don't necessarily do this like when you have a deadline. Like, start experimenting now. Start getting familiar with the camera and the lights and what shadows look like and what works for your type of work now, rather than waiting like the week before the gallery say, hey, we need the photos now. And then you have to like figure out and rush it. And that's when like you come up with all of these issues.
And that leads me to my next topic. I'd like to, in our sort of closing time here, talk about sort of 3 ways we look at artists sharing their images. So whether it be in an email, how do we want that to look like in an email? If you're outreaching to a gallery or a curator or consultant, how do we want the artist's work to look like on an artist website? And then thirdly, social media. So I thought, let's start with this idea of how to share images in an email. It sometimes ends up being quite personal. I will start with the fact that I do love a PDF of work, of an artist, of images, and then also a full caption, as Liz had mentioned. And I then secondarily also like separate JPEGs. So, but I also have sometimes received an email where there might be, 55 images or 100 images attached. It was a quite large amount, but we also need to think about how to strategically make this easy for anybody to read through and disseminate. So Carla, I wanted to start with you. How do you like to receive work in an email?
So exactly as you described, ideally I want a JPEG that just literally has a crop of the image with then all of the, the date, the title of the work, the date, the materials, and the dimensions. And then, if it's something that I have to put together for a PowerPoint presentation for a client, then I do want a high resolution JPEG, or not a high resolution image. Usually I would like it to be at least 300 DPI, no less than 150. A lot of times I just like to have the artist share images via Dropbox. So there isn't such a limit of the image size, the DPI, and then, or via Google document share. So those are the ways I like to receive images from artists. Yeah, so as much information as possible. So then if I have to translate the information, I have all of it ready to go.
And I would agree. I also wanted to add to that, to artists, that a nice tip is always repeat your name as an artist, even on the caption, just because I sometimes think it's something that's at the back of your mind. You think, oh, people know who I am, or it's going in an email. But I always like to, and it's my background as a museum curator as well, is just always have your name at the front of the caption. So name, title, date, medium, dimensions. But when you repeat your name, it's always going to be very clear. So in case someone copies your caption into another presentation, just as you mentioned, your name is already there and it's not going to sort of leave your image as well. So I always like to say the closest thing to your image, when you provide that, should always start with your name as the artist, and then all of the details of the caption. It's just another nice tip to have.
I would also add on to that is you can change your metadata. So if you do have Photoshop, or you have the ability to use and download Photoshop through the Bridge software that is attached to Photoshop, you can change all the metadata. So I think it's very important for artists to put that metadata information in, put your name in, put who was photographed by. You can put your website in there, your phone number, your email. You can put the name of the artwork. So it's all built into this file, and it never leaves the file.
Thank you, Christine. So with, email and email correspondence, I think overall making it as easy as possible for your audience, whoever that audience may be, to disseminate the information or to understand how to use that information. My next question to Liz would be, then when we're looking at artist websites, what is most helpful to you when looking at an artist's career or their work?
Well, I would say the first thing is when you look at a website, that main image, that, especially if it's sculpture, needs to tell a story. So having something that's maybe an exhibition shot or an installation shot. A lot of times when I look at an artist's website for the first time, I'm not clear at all. And there's rarely captions on the front, the main image. I'm very unclear as to how big it is. I don't know the depth of it. I really am kind of in the dark, except for just seeing that, aesthetically, the image. So I always recommend artists have a story in that they put their art in context right when somebody sees something. That just helps me, for sure, know what the work is about. And then also, as we were talking about captions, to make sure that that information can be seen right away on the individual images. It's really important. Again, people are impatient. They're not going to go dig for it. I'm not going to go dig for it. And I will say, backing up to the way to receive emails for me, if it is a JPEG, and I know we were talking about the caption, and I don't know if we were talking about the same thing, because there's the caption that might be typed, very in a lovely way, but then also having the file names of the JPEG, your last name, the title, especially the size and the medium, like in the file name of the JPEG. And I also like to have some things embedded into my email, especially if I don't know the artist. Frankly, if you're sending me something and I can't see it right away, I'm probably not going to open it unless I know you're writing to me for a specific reason. But if you have an email that has a few images embedded, so it's like I can't not see it, it's right there, that will either get me to then decide, ooh, interesting, let me open it, or not. So that's just another thing I recommend, especially sending it to dealers. And as an advisor, I appreciate that too.
And I think it's a great idea to embed in the email, just to give us a snapshot of really kind of who you are. I think when I receive emails that just say, oh, here's my website, please visit my website, that's nice, but I also, it takes us a lot of time to go through, and especially if they're all in separate folders or separate parts of your website as well. And so it's just giving extra steps for each of us. And so sometimes it's a matter of keeping it really clear and concise, and like just a strong little intro of your work to us. So I think I will add that as well about websites in general for artists. I know there's lots of fancy websites that scroll and have all kinds of back end and design, but I also think sometimes the simple will help illustrate your practice. And then also just making sure that somewhere, if someone did want to download your CV, or if you can make sure it's printable. I've been in the past to an artist website where I tried to print the CV, and then it, because of the website design, was trying to print 50 pages. And that's hindering me from, starting a file on that artist. So sometimes make sure just the easy mechanics of your artist website with the photography can be, shared, printed, and like I said, for all of us that are looking for this kind of information and looking for details on how to read your own work. So that would be my overall tip for your website. And I didn't know, Carla, is there anything else that you'd like to add for websites?
So I would like to add, sometimes building a website is really cumbersome and it can also be overwhelming. And I think, I look a lot at Instagram, and I think it's also a great way of looking at a whole body of work, like really quickly. So Instagram is a really great, completely accessible tool. And a lot of people have their private account, and then they have their art career account, and their gardening account. You can set up different interests or even different segments within Instagram. But I really use Instagram as a tool of looking at artists' work a lot, and also being able to see if there's a consistency in the type of artwork that's created. It's a great tool, and not as overwhelming as creating a whole website.
Absolutely. So, and that kind of leads to my last topic before we get to our questions, is how we look at social media. So I think it's certainly an important part of how the art world has evolved. And now it's almost essential that everyone is an artist. If you can handle an Instagram account, please do that and share your work, because that really is where you can share your images. And a lot of these other shot lists, these shots of your work that are showing some of these unique angles and the details of your work. And I do think these details oftentimes tell the story of your material. So it tells the story of the work of art, and of how, and maybe even tells the story of your process. So I will say it, does help kind of create that intrigue. They're not only educational, so we're seeing more about what you see in the studio, or maybe some of these behind the scenes shots. So I think that Instagram can provide a little bit more of a casual approach, but still professional through the imagery through this photography and how you document your work. So I like the idea that social media can be more casual in a sense than a formal website, and maybe even embed your Instagram account on your website if that's something, or if you worry that you can't keep up with updating the website so much, but give your audience those images that help tell that story. And so, Christine, are there any tips that you have for photography, particularly for social media?
Yeah, I think social media can be a really great way of like a window into an artist's practice and an artist studio. I think people really like seeing artists at work. So like even seeing like the steps of the process, taking photographs of like your like the beginning stages of sketching out maybe a sculpture. And the great thing about Instagram is you can actually gather these like at the top, like between where it's like has your profile information, where like your daily things are. You can have these like grouping stories. So you can have like the full, like beginning to completed work, like in all of these photographs that people can just click on this one thing and you can see like the full creation of this work. And I really like when I look at artists' work, I really like seeing those, and I like seeing like their stage process in photographs. I think it can be very interesting and a window into like the way they see things. And photographs are, the way we see that. And videos even too, like you can take videos of all of this, take videos of your work outside if it's an outside piece, walking around it, or even like walking around it, like showing it and then turning the video on you and talking about it and talking about your thought process. Videos of that are wonderful and I think super important, and a way to interact with the artist. And that's why I really like seeing both of those, seeing still images and seeing video images on Instagram.
I think that's a great tip, just to sort of share these behind the scenes, share the stories. And I will also say, be clear also in sharing your own work. It's not that you can't share other artists' work or when you're visiting other galleries, but also be very clear about that, just so that when people are looking at your own account, that it's a majority of your own work, or it's entirely all your own artist's work. So I'm seeing lots of questions come along here. So I think what we're going to do is look at the specific questions in the chat. So I think I'll have Nicole help monitor this, and we make sure. We've gotten to a couple questions so far, but I'd like to turn it over to these specific questions.
Yeah, so for Rebecca and Allison, I do see that you both asked about plexiglass and glass, which I do feel like Jennifer and Christine kind of covered, but I just wanted to check in and make sure that you felt like your question had been answered. So you can feel free to unmute if you need a little more clarification, or type it in the chat box. But either way, just let me know. If you feel like it's been answered, then we'll move on to the next question. So, and that goes for both of you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
So I've been experimenting with also clear plexiglass as a sculptural form, which makes it very difficult to photograph. So super messy work right here. So this is just a draft. You can't photograph the structure. I've tried and it's a blur, which is kind of beautiful for photography, but very bad for documentation.
Yeah.
And I've had people do these kind of gradation backgrounds with sculptures in order to kind of get the different, so you don't, so that kind of grayscale background helps to give it some form. Personally, I don't love the photograph when I see that. I like the piece on the wall because usually like some of them scatter, what I like is they're ephemeral, so they scatter shadows and stuff. So do I need to have multiple, like have the gradation ones, have the installation shots with the light, have the one where it's completely transparent, or is that confusing?
I would say it kind of depends on the audience, and it depends on the gallery, and it depends on the dealer. So if you're trying to get with a certain gallery, like that dealer or that art consultant is going to have a style of photography they like. And that's generally like the photographs that of artists they already represent. So if you go through like their collection of artists, and if you see something where like they have quite a bit of those gradation photos, then you know that dealer likes that style of photography. Because I definitely like cater, I wouldn't photograph that like in the same way I would photograph it in the way like the dealer likes it, the way it looks, and the way the artist likes the way it looks. So you kind of have to balance, the artist and dealer have to come into an agreement of the way they like the work photographed. So unfortunately, it's like not a straightforward answer of do this or do this. It's like, it depends on the situation. The gradation, it can be quite hard to achieve without professional lighting equipment. But you can if you experiment with it. And I would just say like having external light sources. So like getting those clamp lights or getting more professional lighting, those will really help light the work so it doesn't become invisible. Because in that instance, I would say having a little bit of glare like gives it some texture.
Thank you. All right, let me go back a bit. This question came from Michelle, who feels like her oversized work is getting distorted or curved when she photographs it. She has some works, I'm assuming, that have lines, and the lines don't keep straight. So Michelle, feel free to chime in if you want to elaborate just a little bit more. If not, I'll let Christine kind of run with that.
Basically, it's like if it's like an oversized work, I use some some horizontal lines. And when I photograph that, that line kind of like curve a little and it get a little distorted, especially towards the sides. Like if the artwork is smaller, that doesn't happen. But if it's big, it does.
Yeah. So that, can I ask what you're using to photograph it?
A Canon
Your
Rebel.
phone or a Rebel?
Yeah.
So it depends on the lens. It can happen with a more basic lens. It's because you're photographing it at too wide of it, like the lens is too much of a wide angle lens. So if you stick with like a 50 millimeter to a 70 millimeter, you can even go up to like a 90 millimeter sort of depth of lens. You should be able to keep the line straight. When you go into the really wide angle lens, so you're like going into 40 and 30 millimeter lens step, that's when you get that curvature, because it's the curving of the lens piece.
So, I mean, basically the lens that the camera come with, that doesn't work. I need to get like a different lens.
Is it a zoom lens? So it has like, it's like a 30 to 70. Like usually those lenses that come with the Rebel, like it says like 30 to 70 lens. So when you like turn the mechanism on the lens, it like zooms in and zooms out, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you want it zoomed in either halfway or all the way as close it will go, and instead of zooming the lens out so that it makes the work smaller in the viewfinder, and instead of doing that, you just back away from it.
Okay.
So you want to be farther away from the piece.
Okay.
The-
Yeah, I
the
get
closer
difficult
you are
because
and
some
having to
paintings
open
are
the
very
lens.
big.
Yeah, you open the lens up all the way, and like that's when you're getting that curvature, because you're on that outside edge of where the lens can go.
Yeah, I guess I don't get enough space in my studio
Yeah.
to move
Yeah,
back.
that can be
Yeah.
quite difficult, but you can also learn how to correct that in Photoshop. There are tutorials on YouTube, and it's a super easy, super simple. It takes less than a minute to correct.
Okay.
You can, if you don't have the space, like you can correct it in post.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So Susan, I see your question about copyright protection. I don't know if you want to unmute and go into a little bit more detail about, web for social media, but if you want to do that.
Yes. I'm a Canadian and an American, and I work in both places. And I'm very paranoid now because somewhere I was picked up. I have a basic image from me to do a figure, an outlined figure in stainless steel. And someone in Korea picked up my image and made 300 of them and presented them in a competition in Korea and became a winner. So I am very paranoid now about exposing my sculptures, especially my new ones that I'm doing, because my former ones are all on my website, but the new ones I'm doing, I'm afraid to show my new work. And there's no organization that really protects visual artists from copyright infringement. Do you hear me?
Yep. I think we're all just mulling it over.
Yeah. I was going to say, Susan, I'm sorry to hear that, because it
Me
is
too.
one of the, well, it is truly one of the hard parts about as all of this media is available online, people think it's free or that it's not attached to someone specific. So I don't know, let's see who on our panel, can anyone speak to, I mean, it's hard to maybe prevent someone from at least taking a screenshot, but how they can't download certain images off of websites. I'm not particularly, that's not my specialty, but I know there are some protective ways that we can do this.
That's built into the website. You're saying that they can't do that. And the other thing I've done is I've become a photographer because I'm photographing nature and I'm putting it on Facebook. And would you believe I'm getting copied? Even my photographs of nature are being copied because of my vision of what I'm seeing. And the next thing I know, there's that image is showing up. Everybody's doing whatever I did. So it's very, it breeds paranoia, that's for sure. I'm not sure.
Well, Susan, I would say, I guess my best advice would be, for your very important work, then just strategize as to sort of how you will present that to people. And maybe it becomes more that you control how you share that. Maybe it is in a PDF via email to a more closed circuit of your contacts in your network. And then you maybe hold some images just for social media. But in terms of how we can control it, it's very difficult. It's the unfortunate side of how everyone now thinks that just because an image is on Instagram or that they don't need to credit it or check with you first. But I'm seeing it a lot as well. So you're certainly not, which is unfortunate, but you're certainly not alone in that.
I have something to add.
I don't understand, one more point. I don't understand, there's copyright. There's something in Canada called access copyright. I've written a book on protected. Okay, access copyright protects me, but they don't do visual artists. So I'm saying to the International Sculpture Society, maybe it's time we did something to try and protect visual artists from being knocked off.
Susan,
there's nothing out.
I love the question and the thought. I do feel like this is, unfortunately, a little bit strayed from where we're at, but it is a really good point to bring up. I am just wondering, though, bringing it back to photography, and maybe Christine or Jennifer, or anyone can answer, if maybe perhaps some kind of watermarking or labeling your photos in that way would be still acceptable when presenting your work, or just a very minor way to prevent a little bit of that. That's as close as I could connect it, not being a visual artist myself. So if you ladies want to chime in.
I was told by the curator at McGill University that you can just put C for copyright after something. So I just put in an assemblage of driftwood pieces that looks very artistic. And at the top of it, right away, I put copyright. Okay.
Yeah, we
tell
just
you,
go ahead.
Within a month, somebody will be copying it.
We only have a few more minutes. And so I just want to make sure that Liz and I think Christine wanted to chime in. I want to make sure we can do that before the clock kind of times out. And hopefully give you a little bit more insight to, what you can do in terms of the photography. So I'll let either one of you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention, please, God, don't watermark. There's nothing more irritating to me than when I'm looking at something and that there's, the name of the artist. It just, and this is me, but I just find it to be kind of cheesy. The other thing I'll say, and I've said this to other artists, is, we can look at anything, right? And as an artist, you can take that image and incorporate it into your own. I don't know if you ever, emailed or contacted the people in Korea, but in general, if you're not a blue chip, well-known artist, there's really not that much you can do. And, it's kind of a compliment, as much as it feels like a diss. And you at least have this great story about how, your sculpture was obviously, some other artists were taken by it. But I would definitely contact them if you haven't already.
I did. And what they did is they blocked me.
Yeah, well, this is the unfortunate thing about life, but I like your idea of putting the C. I always put in any invoice I make that the copyright belongs to the artist. It's not transferable. Just because they own the piece doesn't mean they can, start making jigsaw puzzles out of it or t-shirts.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. I agree.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Christine.
Okay, so I would say there's not really just in my experience of my photography practice and Instagram and Facebook and social media and the wide world being access to all of your work, there's not really much you can do. It's just something that's like, unfortunately, a part of the industry now because it's so worldwide. But if there is ever an instance when they're asking you to, like, if you do contact, let's say the organization that awarded this person their award, and you say, well, actually, like, I created this work 2 years ago, and here's the metadata from the photograph that predates this person's work. So like, that's when metadata can be super important because it has like all of this information of when the photograph was taken.
Okay.
So you
Yeah, good idea.
like your original ownership, your original idea. In those instances, there's just not much you can do like to prevent it. It's just a matter of like proving it after the fact.
Yeah, I've started doing that. I started doing that on Facebook, dating everything.
Yeah.
We are arriving right at our time, and I want to be mindful of that. So here's the thing. The good news is that Upward and Associates, you can book one-on-one consultations with them. I've put their contact link in the chat. So if you didn't quite get your question answered, you can fill out that contact form for a one-on-one session and they can dedicate their time to you, which is amazing. And they have graciously reserved spots specifically for ISC members for October. So if you've already contacted me with interest, we'll reach out to you about getting stuff scheduled. If you're an ISC member and you haven't contacted me but are interested in one of those one-on-one sessions, you can shoot me an email. I'm gonna put my email address right in the chat for you. I also put the ISC website link. If you're not a member with us, we have a lot of great offerings as part of our community. So we would love to have you chat. I want to thank Amy Snyder, Upward and Associates, Jennifer, Liz, Carla, and Christine for their time. It's been amazing, and their insight has been amazing. And Jennifer, before we officially close, I'll just let you say goodbye.
Well, thank you, Nicole. And I think this was a wonderful collaboration for us to look at photography in specifics. And yes, please contact Upward and Associates for learning more information about how to apply for your free. And I want to underline free. We've still are providing this service as a free mentor session to artists, which is wonderful. So if you are an artist, please apply and/or stay in touch with us, because I do see several of our artists here on the call today. So thank you for everyone that has joined us today and our panelists again, and look forward to doing this hopefully again and providing more program and content like this to share. So thank you all so much.
As do we. Thank you, everyone.